Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructive Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at PureMTGO.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructiveCriticism.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 488 of the Constructive Criticism Podcast. I'm your host, Easy, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Abe Stein.
Yo.
And Mason Esports Clark.
Howdy, gamers.
Do you say howdy ironically or because you're from the South?
Yes.
Like, in your day-to-day life, how often do you say howdy?
Less with people that live here, more of people who don't live here.
So, non-Southerners you say howdy to, but Southerners...
No, I say howdy to Carmen all the time.
Is Carmen Southern?
She was born in Florida and lived in North Carolina.
There you go. That's Southern.
Yeah.
But like you go into a Starbucks and they're like, oh, hey, welcome to Starbucks. And you don't say howdy there.
No. I say hello gack to them.
Now, what if...
It's all ridiculous.
Speaking of caffeine, you might need some this episode because we are going deep into Standard as we talk about the Standard Mega Rankings, covering 4 of the 5 RCs that have already concluded. Before we do that, though, let's talk about always improving. It's the point of the show. We want to be doing everything we can every week to be trying to be always improving. It's, Magic's a really tough game, and every week on the show, we, the hosts, try to join you, the listener, in working on ourselves and working, whether it's life, whether it's Magic, just do something within our week and share it with the listeners on how we too are trying to be better each week. And I'll go first this week. I had a really bad week. Really, really, really bad. But one of the things that I did during the week is not let that affect me in a couple of ways. And one of the ways is that I decided to go play Magic even though I was in a really bad mindset. I used Magic as an escape and went in with the proper expectations. And I'll kind of cover that. So the first thing is I was playing a Pioneer RCQ, and I didn't want to play something hard. So instead I played something bad. I played Blue Eye Control. And when I say bad, I'm not actually memeing. I actually think that this deck has close to 0 good matchups in Pioneer. And the reason that I played it was actually really important is that a couple weeks ago on the show, I talked about my paper mechanics and how they were lacking. And so I wanted something really flowcharty so that I could actually work on paper mechanics specifically. And it totally worked. I actually found myself able to really focus on my mechanics, making sure that I'm taking the proper time during each turn, making sure that I'm, drawing my cards correctly. I'm not knocking cards off the top of my deck, just dexterity issues completely out the window. Had 0 judge calls on myself throughout the day. And it worked. I got back into kind of a rhythm, which was nice.
That is nice. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that we talk about a lot too, where you're talking to players about, and they're like, "Oh, should I do this? Oh, should I do that?" And so much of it matters on what your goals are, right? And I think often people are like, "Oh, that's cool, but my goal is to win the tournament." But sometimes your goal is just to get out of the house for the weekend and work on some skill in Magic, right? And you're a situation of I've got these, dexterity / paper mechanic skills I need to work on. I just want to get out of the house for 6 hours, and this will get the job done, Yeah,
I was really trying to slow down the game. I found myself playing so fast at the last RCQ that I took 6 that I was like, man, I am playing blazing fast for no reason. And one of the things that's really nice about Blue White is that it's very flowcharty. And so you can take the time to go through the flowchart during the turns, which really lets you slow down the game to the pace to let you think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was also going to say, I much like Mason, being able to set that goal for yourself of something other than winning the tournament, and then being happy with the result of I spent my time and energy instead of focusing on winning matches objectively. I'm going to focus on, making sure my thought process is good. I'm going to take this event to get something else out of it. That's something that's so often, I think, that players who are really, it leads a lot of burnout if you're not able to do that for yourself in the times where you need it. Like sometimes you do just want to go play an event with a deck that you like and have fun and not care about the result too much. And that can be really, really, healthy and helpful for you. So I'm glad you're able to do that.
What about you, Ed?
My always improving this week was revisiting ideas that I'd previously kind of ruled out in my standard testing. Specifically, this was trying out the 4-color Legends deck and the Esper Legends deck from the RCs over the weekend. I feel like we even talked about on the standard episode, you and me, Spencer, where we were saying that kind of felt like these Plaza of Heroes like Esper decks needed to change form because the plazas didn't really make a ton of sense anymore, and your mana was like good enough without it. You didn't have to be bound all these legendary cards, and seeing that kind of, just being wrong about that, and seeing that these decks actually do function really well, and having the additional untapped sources for the high intensity spells they were casting, was really successful, in the positioning of a strategy like that was really successful for this weekend, had me just wanting to go back and see what it is I've missed out on, because that was something where I was like, I think these decks are gone. Or I think these are not really what's important anymore. And so doubling back and even going as far as playing like that 4-color build from the Canadian Regional Championship, just really interesting, playing like rares that, I was negging my teammates for drafting in team drafts, like Slogurk in like 4 copies in a standard deck, and like 4 Takanumas, and just all this stuff that kind of looks so crazy from like a just looking at the deck list perspective. If you're someone who just looks at like Goldfish for standard decks and just, what the stock things are. But really trying to understand the innovation and understanding what this archetype brings to the format as it's taking shape more as these RCs are happening is really my always improving moment.
Yeah, I've been talking to a teammate, just, we'll touch on Esper Legends later in the episode, but I've been talking to a teammate about just how wrong I was on that bonus episode today. We were talking about how he was starting to lean towards Esper Legends for the RC and like, why, and like getting into it, and so I'm kind of excited to talk to you about that deck as we get further into the episode.
Yeah, my thing's also about Esper Legends, so I'll just sort of tie into this. I didn't play the 4-color Legends deck yet, but I did play a lot of the Esper Legends deck, specifically Arnie's deck, and the deck was really impressive. And I think where my disconnect came from on the deck is that I thought it was more of a mid-range deck. And I think it's like just an aggro deck. And at first I thought I was like, oh, it's like Abzan aggro. But when I was playing it, I actually just feel like I can play these longer games. So I am really just like applying pressure constantly and curving out on people. And that's what's strong. Like that plus abusing the channel lands. And it was like, pretty impressive. Just how good your curve are. And like things like figuring out Adelaine in the deck and that sort of thing in comparison to having the Connive legend, whose name I can't pronounce. I think is a really big difference in that deck. And I saw Nassif, and I watched a good bit of the RC coverage for Europe, and like Nassif's deck was fine, but seeing like, oh wow, going like Skrelv into Dinnik into Adelaine or into Rafine is so strong. That's not even your best curve, like just really impressive deck. So
yeah, changing my perspective on it as well, and we'll get to it in the main topic, but changing my perspective on that deck from being just another flavor of the mid-range strategies to being like a hate bears deck, like a mid-range deck that is just trying to put enough barriers in play and have enough good combats to snowball the game, really changed my understanding of the format and the positioning of the format. So
yeah. Let's move on. I just want to quickly say that if you want to support the show directly, the best ways to do that are to head on over to patreon.com/ccmtg. Every week on the show, we have questions from patrons. We give shout outs to new patrons. We do a live show for patrons. So head on over to patreon.com/ccmtg. Tons of opportunities to support the show there, as well as the swag store. If you are watching the show anywhere or listening, there's probably a link to the swag store directly in the show notes or just on constructorism.com on the swag page. With that being said, Mason, why don't you talk to the listeners about our new sponsor?
Yeah, we got a new sponsor. We're really excited. We have our Versages ready to go for this main topic. Before you head on to Modern, make sure to stop over at our sponsor, Goblin Char Bargains, and pick up their Karn insurance. That way, whenever you're in Modern, you get Karned, they have your back. Karn insurance. Use code CCMTG at checkout to get 5% off your first 3 months with them.
5% off your car insurance. That's,
Yeah,
that's better than
big.
Geico.
If that artifact won't work, that's where you need car insurance.
That's right.
Can you imagine? You just like sit down at the table and you like activate your artifact. You're like, oh, that doesn't work. You're like, no, I have car insurance.
You just bring out your
You
car
can't.
insurance.
Yeah. Well, now you pull out your car insurance card, and now they know.
I'm equipping this Colossus Hammer opponent, and you're not stopping me. That's why I always have my car insurance.
Yeah, I see Spencer's pouring himself some Bosay juice right now. We're really happy to have these sponsors and working with us. So, awesome. Let's move on to our main topic, though, Spencer. What do we do? What's with these power rankings? What does this mean if you're listening to the show and you haven't listened in a little while?
Yeah, so we took the results from 4 of the RCs, basically all the RCs that had all of the deck lists available, and gave points according to the top 16s. So you get 6 points for first, 5 points for second, 4 for a top 4, 3 for a top 8, and 2 for a top 16. And we kind of end up with 5 decks, and then if you combine decks, some other archetypes that are good, quote unquote, as for kind of a top 8. And I'm just to get things out of the way, I'm just gonna read it from top to bottom, or from bottom to top. At 6 points we had Mono Blue. At 12 points in the honorable mentions we had red aggro decks. This includes Rakdos. Then with 13 points, if you combine Jund, Grixis, and Black-Red, you have the Black-Red Reanimator decks. And then in the actual power rankings in 5th place, at 12 points, you have Green-White Toxic, which was invented after the first round of RC, so it didn't get as much time. Mono-White with 15 points, Blue-White Soldiers with 17 points, Esper Legends with 30 points, and then Grixis with 61 points. So, with that being said, let's dive into the honorable mentions really quick. Kind of a simple summary of them. I'll go over Mono Blue first. This deck is basically a Protect the Queen style tempo deck that is trying to... Its key cards are... Oh my gosh, how do you say the Jin's name?
Haughty Jin.
Haughty Jin. Just trying to protect it with different spells, and then kind of close the game out with either a big flyer or cheap Tolarian Tears.
I have a question. Have you been playing more of this deck, Spencer? Because I know you were really high on it 4 weeks ago. When I first got back from the show, we talked about it some. Is that right? 3 weeks ago? Deck. Okay. Have you continued to play it with like the 4 flow of knowledge and stuff like that?
So I am not up to 4 flow of knowledge. I played as many as 3 flow of knowledge. Flow of knowledge is a really important card in the fact that it kind of wins games by itself. Mm-hmm. By letting you recoup some of the like tempo, the stuff that the card advantage that you traded for tempo early in the game can then be turned into raw cards later.
Mm-hmm. I just mentioned it because until I played the Esper Legends deck, this was the #1 deck on my sort of RC list. And what I was finding was that with the 4 flows and everything and sideboard plans, that this deck was like kind of weirdly a mid-range deck in some matchups post board, where you just sort of like grinded, and then you eventually became like a Protect the Queen, like in the way that some decks protect Shieldred. You just protected like Haughty Jin or whatever, and you just one shot them.
One of the things that I said on the episode with Mythic Cast with Yeoman 5 was I think this deck is actually like almost a control deck in the way that the games play out.
Yeah, I believe that.
Yeah, I think the only card that changes that dynamic is when the deck is playing Delver Secrets, because otherwise, all of your threats are not coming down in a stage of the game to like be getting under anything, with the exception of Delver. So you're leaning on your interaction to generate space to land a win condition or to pull ahead with something like flow.
Yeah.
And so it definitely plays that way.
Let's move on to the rest of the honorable mentions. We have red aggro decks. This deck is really interesting. I think that this deck has had probably the most top 16s in like challenges since the format began. It's kind of crazy. And I think it's totally reasonable. I personally really like the Black Splash. I'll just say that up front. There's a certain card that costs white that actually just dumpsters red removal decks right now. And honestly, I think that if you're not prepared for this deck into this standard format, you're probably going to lose to it. Some of its key cards are, its biggest key card is Thundering Raiju. And then I would say just other hasty threats that come down before that and continue to put pressure on turn after turn after turn and really turn your opponent's removal into bad removal because that's a bad equity trade is the really key important parts of this deck.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of biggest issue with the mono red deck is that once it was no longer, and it hasn't really been positioned in something where it's doing something unique to the format, it's getting under people by the way that its curve is. This black red deck has kind of replaced the issue of the card quality not quite being there for a lot of the mono red draws. Like your Phoenix Chick is not really the best card. A lot of your 2-drops leave a lot to be desired, but look at that black red aggressive deck where it's able to play Bloodtithe Harvester and play some of the more potent black cards, and be like a smaller version of Grixis and a bigger version of mono red kind of lands it in a spot where it's actually able to like hang, which has been really, really strong.
For what it's worth, the only black creature it plays is the Bloodtithe Harvester.
Yeah,
it plays Graveyard Trespasser.
Oh, you're right. That one did. You're right.
Yeah. I mean, I assume that's the one that's giving it the majority of the points. At top 4, the Canadian RC in Vancouver, and it's interesting to me because it sort of looks to me like when sometimes you talk to players about like how to play red black in Pioneer, you tell them that like you're sort of like trying to clear the way a little bit and go under them in a lot of matchups. And this deck sort of is doing a similar thing of like, I'm going to be aggressive and a little bit bigger than like a mono red deck is. Specifically the Rakdos deck, obviously. And like my creatures are a little chunkier and they have a little bit more value, but they still like attack really well. And I think Bloodtithe Harvester and Graveyard Trespasser do a good job of incorporating that. So it's a really cool deck.
Why don't you talk to the listeners about the Reanimator deck, Mason?
The Reanimator deck is basically what it sounds like. You're trying to get Atraxa into play using the Cruelty of Gix saga. There are a couple different versions of this, and really people are trying to pick the version that's sort of best for the weekend. There's a Jund, a Grixis, and a red-black. Jund and Grixis are much more like actually mid-rangey and much more about needing to get the Reanimator in play because they sacrifice some of the key interactive cards that the normal versions of those decks play in order to play the cards to get Atraxa in. The black-red deck is sort of this weird mid-rangey deck that has a bunch of treasures, and so it can also just cast Atraxa weirdly easily. And that deck's main goal is just to play a normal game and sometimes cast Atraxa. And the black one even sideboards out Atraxa a fair bit, which is super potent.
Yeah. And just to be clear, the ways you're getting treasure are the Fable and the Big Score.
Fable, Big Score, Dragon, and the 2-drop with Blitz.
The 2-drop with Blitz?
Yeah, there's like a 3/1 for 2 that.
Oh, yeah, I know what card you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't know.
And the Jund deck also has like Armored Scrap Gorger, so it can also like hard cast Atraxa. Almost, I think some builds of the Grixis build, I think they moved away from it. They were also playing the Big Score, and they could like make treasure tokens and had some interest in being able to cast Atraxa, but it really is primarily using, blood tokens and Fable to like get Atraxa in the bin, and then using the Cruelty of Gix as kind of a, there's times in playing the deck where I've found that even just casting a Cruelty of Gix is like a big Eldest Reborn. It's just really potent in the mid-range fights where they start to slog, where you're able to like get their Shieldred out of their hand and then tutor up your removal spell that you need or your own threat. Could even be picking up, like finding the Atraxa with your blood token in play so that you can use that before you get to chapter 3 and bring that back to really seal the game. So
so I was just gonna say that was a really potent thing I saw in coverage a lot, where the players were setting up turn 6 Gix. They turn 6 Cruelty of Gix because they would discard the Atraxa to blood and then slam Gix because of Corpse Appraiser being one of the most popular cards in the metagame. Mm-hmm. And just having main deck graveyard hate was such a problem, so it was just worth it because it turns out, Atraxa a turn early is still very good. So
awesome. So that'll do it for the honorable mentions decks. Let's dive into our 5th place deck with 12 points. We have Green-White Toxic. Abe, why don't you take it away with this one?
Yeah, the Green-White Toxic deck was like probably the biggest breakout deck of the RC weekend 2 weekends ago, where it won the RC, if I'm remembering correctly, right in the hands of Bryce Otto, or did he
got second?
Okay. Second with it, and so really it is kind of like a block constructed deck almost of like the offenders that you would expect, right? It's Crawling Chorus, Venerated Rot Priest, Skrelv, Skrelv's Hive, And really where I've found the biggest strength of this deck to be is that it has so much utility in its lands between the Seed Core and Mirrex that like Skrelv's Hive is just being an enchantment is really, really strong against a lot of the mid-range decks, especially the black mid-range decks like Grixis. And the ability to go wide like that is really, really strong. But getting on the board early and getting wide and then never really running out of ways to continue to apply that pressure and either toxic out or damage out the opponent has just been a really, really impressive way for the games to go. And was really attacking the format from a unique angle in that first week it came out. It was like, like I said, the breakout deck of the tournament. I think it really changed the way that a lot of people prepared for the next round of RCs the weekend following. And, I think that placing fifth here in our power rankings after having that second place finish is kind of testament to the ability for the format to, as a whole, to adapt to these kinds of things. The same way we saw Mono Red kind of show up and have a big week and then get, people figure out the answers and figure out the way to build their decks to beat that. And then Green was attacking a different angle in a different way, play patterns people didn't quite get, and then they found ways to adapt their decks and kind of pare it down. This deck is still very strong and is probably if you're someone who really likes to play aggressive decks, and that's like the case for some people in my play group, where they have just like, I'm committing to this because this is very much my play style. It's all about having good combats and like understanding how to sequence and like what the game's going to be about in terms of, am I winning with toxic, am I winning with damage? Deck is really, really, really strong, and there's a lot of room there to even optimize it further, I think.
Yeah, I think that Skrelv's Hive, well, I already thought that card was going to be good. I think that getting corrupted in this deck is basically trivial. So the creatures basically always have lifelink, and that is nonsensical in some games where it's like, okay, well, I don't actually know how to race this or beat this. And I think it's a huge, huge plus for the deck.
Yeah, the lifelink ability, I mean, I think there's kind of been a trend for the last month or so where the decks have been getting more streamlined. The games have been becoming smaller and smaller and more about, affecting the board and being ahead because the games are tighter. There's not as much of a mid-range slog going on because people have figured out ways to attack that. And as that's continued, the ability to just have lifelink means that as people are trying to race you, especially when you have the green-white uncommon that whenever you attack the toxic creature, it gets +1/+1. The name's escaping me right now. But whenever you have that and a bunch of the 1/1
Slaughter Singer, by the way.
Yeah, when you have Slaughter Singer and a bunch of the tokens, like that's a really big life swing when you're like, I can't really afford to chump attack everything. Like I have to chump attack everything away in order to try to win this race because I need to toxic them out. But the fact you're also going to gain like 8 or 9 life, maybe 10 life on that combat, and then still, maybe keep 1 or 2 tokens, be able to make one with Mirrex and go again the following turn. And it's reducing turns that your opponent has to kill you is really, really potent. Like that card is the reason the deck is as good as it is, in my opinion, in the metagame. And I think that the amount that people have had to adapt to it is really shown in the following week.
Yeah, Seed Core is also another really strong land they get access to. Sort of reverse Spindlehaven, if you haven't seen it, gets +2/+1 to a 1/1 creature. And then also just lets you cast your Phyrexian creatures. There's like no life loss with that, which I think a lot of people just like tack that on because that's normally how these cards work, but not this time. And it just allows you to sort of have pretty good mana and also mana that like rewards you as the game goes on. So you like, you're not making these chump attacks as often, and I think this deck is really impressive. And I think the part of the reason, why we didn't see it do better this week is things like Nightclubber being picked up by like, the Grixis players and stuff like that to answer this deck. And it's a moment of like, if they don't have those sort of cards, they have a really hard time with this, which we saw evident in the Japanese RC where the players just didn't have stuff for this and it was crushing them. So.
Yeah. Up next in 4th place, we have our mono white deck. This deck is basically mono white midrange. It relies a lot on simulated card advantage, whether it be through its planeswalkers or through its small creatures, to hold down the game or kind of take over the game in different ways. and then kind of it follows the rules of engagement of this format of like playing a really powerful 3-mana enchantment in the form of Wedding Announcement.
And the Restoration of Iganjo. Like
that's true. That card actually
that card
has
is
been really
basically the White Fable, the Mirror Breaker. You know, like you get a land out of it immediately. It's actually a good body. It's like a threat that people do have to deal with, and it's tough to deal with. And it also just you do get a little bit of advantage out of it. Like there's times you get that planes, you get back your Spirited Companion or your Reckoner Bankbuster that might have gotten duressed or abraded or something, and like over the course of a really long game, that really adds up. Or even just getting back a Roadside Reliquary. Like this is what I consider the like going late kind of mid-range deck where it's trying to grind the games out and like slog in a way to make it so that like it's saying the games aren't really going to be about getting under me, or I have plans for that, and I'm going to take you in a really long game. You have to do something to go over the top of me because I will grind you out.
I want to mention that the one that won in Vancouver also happened to be playing 8 Field of Ruin effects to really punish the mana bases that people have been playing. And getting to do that in this format is kind of crazy.
It's really, I mean, especially in the finals they played against the 4-color Slogurk Esper Legends deck, which played no basics, which was funny. It's just sort of like last round of the tournament, it's all coming together. But in other rounds too, there's just aren't that many basics, right? Like a lot of these decks are playing. Even the green-white Toxic deck, I think, only had like 5 basics, like at most or whatever. And so, like, maybe a little harder to get them. Sorry, I misspoke. They are playing 1 basic. Sorry, I misspoke. They have 1. So, like, you can get everybody, and that deck has, like, a bunch of utility lands you want to blow up, too. So, I think the mono-white having the 8 Field of Ruins, maybe 8's extreme, maybe 1's 6. I don't know exactly. I'm not a Field of Ruin scientist. But it's a really interesting dynamic, like you mentioned there, Spencer, that really adds a lot to the deck.
Yeah, I mean, he said on Twitter, too, after winning, he was like, you should just cut the basics from your deck because I have so many Field of Ruins that the 1 basic isn't really going to make that much of a difference for you. Because he was saying, like, even against the 4-color Legends player, I think he said he Field of Ruined him, like, 5 times in the match. But that match still went on, like I don't know, it's still a lot of investment to do that, and I've been thinking about that too. Is like, do you want to adjust? Are people going to be doing this in mono white? Is this thing to do? But I think it's more been a reaction to things like Mirrex and the Seed Core, or like Plaza of Heroes being potent. I don't know how you guys feel about that. Than it necessarily being like, oh, I'm going to be able to punish the mana bases.
I don't think it's trying to do that, right? Like I think that it just happened to be like, I don't need 20 planes, right? Like there's just no reason for you to do it. Although
outside of lay down arms,
8 is a lot.
Yeah. Lay down. Yeah. If once you decide you don't want to play lay down arms, or you're okay with like you identify that like you're okay with your lay down arms maybe being like 1 or 2 less, like 1.5 less able to answer things on average, then like doing this sort of thing makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I kind of want to talk about this deck going into this format. Going into this new set, this is one of the 2 decks that people thought was the one like had the opportunity to be the best deck, right? People thought it had a good Grixis matchup. People thought it had a decent, I guess the mono blue was a question mark. Where do you guys think this deck stands today?
I really like its positioning, and I like it for a couple of reasons. One is that I think, kind of based on everything else that happened in the format over the weekend, the Grixis decks and the Esper decks both have pushed their range of the game they're trying to win in down some. So it's a lot easier for a deck like Mono White to actually be effectively going over the top of things. And in pushing their decks down, I think that the Atraxa decks, which were honestly one of the hardest things for Mono White to deal with, those decks are performing worse as Dennick has become kind of a like premier 2-drop of the format across all of these Esper decks, and it's just been a really good option shutting down the Reanimator strategies, a lot of random graveyard synergies, and being a good creature to have a blocker against the more aggressive decks that are popping up in the format. So I think that as far as positioning goes, the mono white deck is something you can't really forget about, because if you are playing like Grixis and you go the way of I'm forgetting his name, the player who won the Naples event. like where you don't play many bank busters, you're really not focused on the long game, you're not going to play a game that takes a lot of time, then this mono white deck will eat you alive. And before it was kind of a little closer on those margins, but I think mono white's positioning has kind of improved, even if like it still has its weaknesses, and it's obviously not infallible, but it's definitely in a really, really strong spot.
Yeah, the mono white deck, to answer your question, in my opinion, is like fairly well positioned. It has some bad things. Like I don't think its blue matchup is really bad, especially as blue players who just start playing.
Thank you for saying that, because like I had somebody say that they didn't think that like they could beat mono white with blue, and I was like, I think that matchup is so good for blue.
Yeah, I mean, they probably just aren't playing 4 main deck negates. It's probably just what's going on there. I mean, like maybe they are, and they're just misevaluating their role in the matchup. But I think the deck has like exploitable weaknesses, but like Abe mentioned, if Grixis players are trying to adapt to like Esper Legends and Soldiers and Toxic and fight those fights, they're going to lose on these fights. And it's a lot of like, I think, picking your spot in sort of a classic standard environment of like, okay, well, the metagame's rotating. Where do I want to be on things, And this is sort of trying to be like, yeah, if Grixis is trying to really fight, Toxic aggro decks or whatever, then like, okay, this is a great spot to be. So
yeah, what's interesting is like the format is almost about this deck in Grixis in a lot of ways, where it's about getting under the Fables and the Wedding Announcements and the what's the other 3-mana enchantment called? The
Restoration of Aganja.
Yeah, Restoration. Or it's about like going bigger than these decks, right? With like Atraxa or stuff. Or it's just being these decks. So I think this deck just has a solidified spot in this metagame, and how you build it will depend, like many other mid-range decks throughout history, on how you see the format looking.
Yeah. It's always weird to me that people also haven't tried like make disappear in this deck and things like that. Like maybe they have, and this hasn't done well, but I have not seen many people try to like splash with this deck. So
I think a lot of the reason people haven't splashed, because I've thought about doing it, is that you kind of are incentivized to splash with a lot of tapped blue sources because your laydown arms are really like something you're leaning on.
Sure.
So like if you play a bunch of Deserted Beaches and Outercore Wastes, it starts to make it so that you can't like lay down arms as Shieldred with much consistency, and that's like definitely something you want to do. What I will say is really impressive about William LaHaye's list from that he won that RC with is he moved away from previously the decks played a lot of like Farmhand, the 1/1 that searches for a plains, a lot of the plains searchers, in playing all these Field of Ruins in order to say like I'm not going to thin all the plains out of my deck and then play these lands that need me to have more plains in my deck. Was able to play like he played Cathar Commandos and more Spirited Companions and 4 Bank Busters. And especially Cathar Commando is a card that, like, I can only imagine in a world where we're worried about Skrelv's Hive, we're worried about, Fable the Mirror Breakers, worried about opposing Wedding Announcements, Restoration of Ganjos, and with cards like our own Restorations and Sarah Paragon, it's actually a really, really good way to go from amassing like a bunch of positive card advantage to really making exchanges on the board, which is somewhere where I feel like the mono white decks have had issues in my experience with these other builds. And so that's something I definitely wanted to note as like, even mono white decks are adapting to what's going on in terms of the way they're building. And I think that the way that, William navigated that in saying, kind of finding an opportunity to not play some of the mopier creatures to help you hit a bunch of planes, because he said I'm fine not doing that. The Cathar Commando is definitely a card that impressed me when I was thinking about it.
Coming in with 17 points, we have blue-white soldiers based on why you talk about this deck really quick.
Blue-white soldiers is a deck that is looking to abuse its mana curve, kind of. It's sort of, a lot like the other decks we're talking about. It's trying to get underneath these 3-mana enchantments that are playing to the board. And the blue-white soldiers deck is sort of saying, hey, if you play the Soldiers Payoff instead of some of these other things, you get some really strong cards. Some of those key ones being like, well, Dinnik is like one of the hate bears we talked about being really big. Harbin, the Vanguard adversary, like it lets you draw cards. Then you have, I believe it's like Sky something, lets all your soldiers get flying. Sky Strike Officer. So, excuse me, you just have a really good way of putting a lot of pressure on the board early and then having some payoffs for playing all these soldier cards. And you actually just, sort of like the Infect deck or like the red deck. You're just sort of going under these other decks. And this one probably has a little bit of more game and going long than those other two decks do, but give up some potency by doing that.
I think that one of the really important things about this deck is it's had a longer time in the sun than some of the other aggressive decks. And the reason that it's had that is it's had a usable mana base for an aggressive deck longer than any other aggressive deck other than mono red. And because of that, I think that these decks are pretty tuned. They're pretty popular, and it gets to use a lot of the other aggressive cards that, like it gets to place, Skrelv. It gets to, use Plaza of Heroes. Some of the things that some of the other decks are doing. I think this deck, one of the key things that I think about when I see this deck is like, it's 3 drops, and that might just be a pinching point in the format. But getting to be another Thalia deck, but that also gets to play like Siege Veteran, and you mentioned Skystrike Officer. They're almost attacking from different angles in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I mean, the only new card in the deck list, I'm double checking to make sure before I say this for sure. Yeah, the only new card is, I guess, Mishra's Foundry and Skrelv. There's like a few copies of Skrelv in these decks. So it's really
I said Plaza of Heroes instead of Mishra's Foundry. And I definitely meant to say Mishra's Foundry.
This one apparently played one Plaza as well. But yes.
I know, but I did mean to say Mishra's Foundry. I just saw the Plaza of Heroes and it came out of my mouth.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but it's really it's like if Green-White Toxic is a block constructed deck, this is actually just last block constructed deck. And it's still, really potent. I think it's really engaging in the format. And what we see in the way the format has shifted over the last couple of weeks, the rules of engagement for the format are you need to be playing to the board, you need to have a game plan for winning on the board, and this deck does both of those things, as well as having a way to trump that, right? Like Skystrike Officer makes a bunch of 1/1s that go up the ground at the same speed that Skrelv's Hive does. Eventually those 1/1s, not only are they drawing you cards from your Skystrike Officer's ability, but your Harbin is going to seal the deal by just making them jump over everything. You have Denix to disrupt your opponents who are trying to reanimate on you. You have Thalias to slow down everyone. It really is just a bunch of the good cards supported by the rest of the tribal theme, and your mana is really consistent, like Spencer said. But I just want to point out that overall, a lot of these decks that are performing in the and even as we move up the list, a lot of the trends for decks that performed well are the ones that are seeking to play to the board, and Soldiers is just a very good deck at doing that.
I'm kind of curious, what are your guys' opinions on the placement? What is this deck's place in the metagame? What do you think it has problems with?
I think it's just a worse version of Esper Legends. Is my sort of new, after seeing the new ones, that's my big complaint. It has better 1-drops, or it has more, I should say. But I'm not super in love with this deck. It's totally fine. Yeah, I don't have much positive to say about it, but I don't have much negative to say either.
Yeah, I think that it's something where it's funny. It was this is probably going to be just one of the best decks. It was one of the best decks before Phyrexian came out, but it feels like it's kind of been forgotten about in a lot of the decks people are talking about or thinking about. And it is still a good deck, but I think that, much to what Mason's saying, I think it's good because of the fact it's playing by the rules. It's doing the right kind of thing, but you're able to do such better things and more powerful things
that would be
in the same space.
That would be exactly where I would go, is if we're going by what, like you said, the rules of engagement are for the format, it technically follows them, but I don't know that it's following them in a way that makes me want to do this instead of other stuff. Yeah. I don't know that it's setting its own rules, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's following the rules. It's not really dictating them.
Right. Coming in with 30 points, we have Esper Legends. This is a deck that you guys both want to talk about. Mason, do you want to take it away on this one?
Sure. Esper Legends can be built a couple different ways, but essentially this deck is just an Esper deck that's trying to curve out and then use some of the powerful legends and standard use cards like Plaza of Heroes to make it so your mana is really playable, and then it abuses the channel land. So Otawara, Agancho, and Takanumi are all lands that abuses that. Often you can activate those cards for 1 mana on all of them, and you sort of just curve out on people. I know Abe sort of mentioned it like a Hate Bear deck. I sort of mentioned like a Beatdown deck. I'd be curious to have a more conversation about that. But my experience in playing this deck is just you sort of curve on people and you present things like Dennick or Thalia into Rafine or Adelaine, and then just apply a lot of pressure and then slam a Shieldred and just sort of kill them. Especially the big innovation to add a wedding announcement to the main deck, I think did a lot to really help this deck. And I think Esper Legends is probably best or second best deck in the format right now. I know it won the standard challenge as well this past weekend. It's just really good and has a lot of customization to it.
Yeah, this is one of those decks that we talked about. We talked about this in the pre-show. Like, I just wasn't impressed with it. I didn't quite understand why to do this over some of the other mid-rangey stuff that you could be doing in the format. And I think there are actually a lot of reasons that I was missing out on. I do think that Adeline has also changed my mind a little bit. But I do think that being the best Thalia deck in this format is actually important. Especially for a deck that doesn't actually play a lot of ways to like beat yourself up with that. I think I underrated that quite a bit.
Yeah, I think the value of Thalia has really started to show up as, we've been trying to make decks have been trying to make room to slow down the pace with which they're interacted with, especially as the other aggressive decks have come into the format, where there are times where even in your like when I've been playing Esper against Toxic, we're being able to play like a turn 2 Thalia on the play, so they can't play Skrelv's Hive on turn 2, is really, really disruptive and really problematic for them. Because there's so many of the like non-creature permanents that matter, slowing those down has been really, really important. I will also say that a lot of the success in Esper Legends comes from, to speak to what you're saying, Mason, about me saying it's a Hate Bears deck and you saying it's like a beatdown deck. I think it really is a marriage of both. I think that in understanding that, like, all of their 2-drops are 2-drops that are selected to be attacking the format from an angle that's going to make it difficult for the opponent, right? Thalia is going to make it difficult for a lot of decks. Dennick is going to make it difficult on the random rare decks and on the aggressive decks. It has lifelink, and it's just hard to remove. It also is okay against the mid-range decks of the Disturb backside. Like, it has a little bit of value. It's just a good role-playing card. And then the Razor Verge Transmogrifier, the 3/1 that can be returned from the graveyard if your opponent has a bunch of non-basics. All of those are really thorns in the side of like most of the decks in the format. And then leaning into that understanding of, okay, my 2-drops, like Skrelv into my 2-drops is going to be my strongest thing to do because all of the removal that people are playing costs 2 mana, is going to be following that up with Rafine, or by extension, when this is kind of in the innovation of Adeline being your like Rafine's, 5 through 7, make it so that you're now presenting problems in the form of aggression, because these cards are so good on rate and so good at building a presence, but also still presenting these other obstacles to the game plan of like Thalia making it hard to have the time to stem the bleeding, or a Dennick making it so that you can't get all the value you need to keep up in a game that's that long because you're shut out on some of it. Or like, a couple counters get on there from Rafine and now suddenly you can't race effectively at all. And then being backed up by Shieldred, the ultimate, like, I guess of the format, the ultimate threat that requires answering, means you're really just making a House of Cards happen, which to me is what I like consider really being Hate Bear's identity, is it makes a House of Cards and then wins through combat. And so, while I think that a big part of the House of Cards is those aggressive things, I think that the other surrounding factors are why I like refer to it as a kind of Hate Bears deck, but I think we're both on the same page there.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page.
One of the things mentioned earlier in the episode that we didn't talk about yet in this part of the segment is its ability to play and kind of abuse the legendary lands itself. Mason, why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, this deck plays, I think, 8 of them. It plays like 3 Aganja, 3 Odawara, and 2 Takanumi, at least the list I had ripped. And that's like a pretty big deal because those lands are pretty powerful and they're also just lands. And they're cost 1 less to channel for each legendary creature you control when your deck is like 96% legendary creatures. Just means they cost so little and they provide such big impact. So like your opponent taps out for a Shieldred and you like, played, Rafine on 3 and then you played Adeline on 3 and left a mana up, just means like, oh, I get to Odawara your Shieldred now, like slam into you. Or like I get to attack in with impunity because I can Aganjo and still develop afterwards.
Dude, I straight up just forgot about the channel effect against this deck the first time I played against it in a while, which I don't know why I forgot, but I definitely got Aganjo'd real hard and was like, I'm a moron. Like I'm so
that was my experience too when I played against it in some Mana Traders matches. Was I just like attacked with something and they had like a mana open? I was like, there's nothing they can have here. And then they just dealt 4 to my creature and it died. And I was like, there's something they can have here. And that like really, that's where the light kind of went on for me. And really a lot of the strength of the deck was not only do they get access to these lands at their best, when these are really powerful effects to have, untaxed by Thalia at instant speed, uncounterable, but also that they have access to playing like 28 or 29 lands in the deck that needs to curve out, where then drawing your excess lands because you're able to play 8 or 9 of these means that it's not the worst thing in the world, because even if you're looting away your other lands with Rafine or you have to play one out, eventually the land you top deck is going to be a spell some amount of the time, be that a Plaza protecting your Shieldred or whatever your Rafine, whatever your actual threat that you're winning with is, or one of these channel lands being a way to impact the board and get another combat step, or get another threat back and keep the pressure on. And really that, and speaking about the 4-color deck, playing Slogurk in this deck, and I'm going to give you the text on Slogurk because I don't imagine anyone listening.
Oh, do we need readers? Do people not know what Slogurkian does?
Yeah, it's a 1. I'm going to do this without looking because I'm very familiar now. It's a 1 blue-green 3/3 legendary creature with trample, and it says whenever a land is put into your graveyard from anywhere, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So it has the ability to grow when you channel a land, which is really nice. And then also, whenever you can remove 3 +1/+1 counters from it to return it to your hand from the battlefield. So if you get 3 counters on it, you can return it and pick up those lands as well. Because when it leaves play, be that it dies or it goes back to your hand or it gets exiled, you get to return up to 3 target lands from your graveyard to your hand. So this enables some really, really weird things going on where like that 4-color build plays like 4 Takenuma, because that can just randomly be like giant growth my thing and get a card back, and then when the Slogurk dies, you're like looping the Takenuma, and it really, I cannot say enough about this bulk rare because it really changed the way that I think about these Esper decks, and it's also just like a very strong creature because it doesn't that cut down to boot.
Yeah, Slogurk's nice.
Let's talk about the deck that everybody's been waiting for us to talk about this whole episode. Coming with 61 points, literally double the next best deck. A deck that I don't think is double as good as the next best deck is Grixis midrange.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that on Grixis, like, it has double the points of the next best deck, Esper, but it had to have, like, 3 times the metagame share of Esper, right? Maybe more.
I would
assume. Across all the events. Like, I know it was like 30% of the field was Grixis.
Yeah. Here's the thing. Like, I've heard multiple people say, like, if you don't register Grixis for these RCs, you're an idiot. And I just don't think that's true. So for those who don't know, like, if you are just, like, finally getting ready to do your standard preparation, Grixis has been the best deck for a while. It basically is built on the back of Bloodtithe Harvester, Corpse Appraiser, Shieldred, and Fable of the Mirror as kind of this, like, mid-range package. It has a lot of different ways that you can build it. There's a lot of different cards that you can pick to either win the mirror or, kind of fight different fights. My personal favorite, I think the one that won in Japan was playing was Bloodcoil Serpent. One of the things that the deck was also doing was playing Mendix Brotherhood's End to fight the mono white decks, as well as the soldiers decks. Overall, like, it's just a good mid-range deck. Like, it's really, really good. I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts on where Grixis stands right now?
Grixis is like good. I mean, I think it's awkward because we should talk about Grixis in this section and not about like why it's more than double. I think I don't know. It's a personal thing, but like Grixis is good. It gives you a lot of options to fight what's going on. There are enough tools in this format because we live in a world where standards designed around Rogue Refiner variants that you can build your Grixis deck to fight just about anything, and players are really like that, and you can adapt to what's going on. We see that happen. Like, 2 weeks ago, they got abused by the Green White Toxic deck. Then the next week, they're like, okay, we have Nightclub or we have Malfunction. We can stop these sort of things. And then players are like, okay, well, can you stop this? And then a new problem is presented to Grixis. So presenting problems to Grixis is like one part of the meta game. And Grixis' job is to be prepared for what's going on that weekend in a very similar way to Murktide, which you see is always a very popular deck in Modern, a very similar way to Rakdos and Pioneer, which you see is very popular in that deck always. Grixis is really good. It's definitely not a punt to play that deck, and you just need to be like sort of aware what's going on, and also just don't over metagame your deck, and you sort of are left with like a totally reasonable choice. I think the power level in this format is fairly flat, which is part of why Grixis is able to adapt.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking, like, its job is to bob and weave, right? Like, it is like the ultimate boxer in this format. It takes a punch and then figures it out and punches right back. But if you get it wrong, you're taking a hook shot to the chin, and like that's rough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if either of you guys watched the European RC top 8. Mm-hmm. At all, or familiar with the deck list, but the like quote unquote stock Grixis decks and the deck that won that event look pretty different in a couple of ways. And a lot of the stock Grixis decks, they were good, they performed well, they converted some players top 8, some players cashed with them, they were kind of all over the place, just good solid deck to be playing. But I think it's really, really telling of the tale of Grixis that the deck that won in RC was the one that was forward thinking in the way that it was presenting itself, where it was playing a lot more cheap removal. It didn't care about cards like Reckoner Bankbuster as much because it wanted, to the player's admission in the postgame interview was he didn't want to have cards that took that much time and investment to get cards back out of. He was much more interested in playing to the board. And what that meant was that when he played against Esper Legends, kind of the breakout deck of the weekend, 3 times in the top 8, he beat it all 3 times. His deck was built to have the right answers for the kinds of things that he was going to be worried about. And that really, really paid off. And so if you're someone who takes the time to consider how is it I'm building my Grixis deck, to be that, have that read on what the decks are going to perform well on the weekend are and what those dynamics are, it's going to be hard to argue against Grixis. I think that this was probably the best deck to register on the weekend, and it came through that way, right? Because you're the most consistent against everything because the power level is pretty flat, your cards are consistently good, and then also you were hedged in the right ways for the way that the weekend shaped out. But knowing how to do that and having the confidence to do that, is tough. And a lot of times if you're just going to play Grixis a week behind, your deck's still going to be fine, but you're going to find yourself battling uphill against players who come in with, good plans or seek to exploit what they think like looking at the deck list from this weekend. Okay, this was the best way to build Grixis. So I assume everyone's going to do this. How can I exploit that? Understanding what that thought process is going to be like from the rest of the metagame becomes the challenge of being the Grixis player. One
of the questions I've gotten about it is actually about Grixis. Like, hey, what is your Grixis like? What how is it going? And to me, Grixis is not off the table for me to play at the RC. However, I don't see a reason. I've played a lot of Grixis. I feel comfortable in the Grixis mirror. So for me, a lot of the time that I'm going to put into Grixis, if I play it, will be the week leading up to the RC. That will be the time where I'm like, what does the metagame look like? What do I expect at this tournament? How do I want to build this mid-range deck to do it? Where the rest of my time right now is spent putting pen to paper or cardboard to table and actually seeing, is this viable? Is this real for the other strategies in the format?
Yeah, I think you're just wasting your time if you play Grixis right now. I mean, that's not fair. Maybe you aren't as well experienced with mid-range decks, and maybe you've got to get used to this, and maybe that's not your cup of tea. But if you've played Grixis type decks and mid-range type standard decks in the past, and you know how to like metagame your deck and tune, I cannot imagine wasting any of my time playing the Grixis deck until the week before the RC. All your information is informed by like a week or two beforehand, because players are going to start getting cards, and that's the result, and they're going to start buying cards. And you shouldn't be caring about what Grixis was doing 3 weeks ago. Like, who cares what Grixis was doing 3 weeks ago? It's a metagame deck, so like you have to metagame for the weekend at hand. So if you want to do that, the best way to do it, and you have the ability, maybe you don't have the availability via Arena or Card Hoarder or whatever, or Mana Traders, but like just play the other decks and get an idea for how they work, so you can be ready. Like, what are you doing playing Grixis?
Yeah, to boil it down, I would say if you spend your time figuring out how to beat Grixis right now and then build Grixis to beat that without sacrificing a bunch of other places, you're going to have a really good Grixis list. But if you spend your time just being like, how do I'm just keep on playing build to Grixis, you're going to be one of the Grixis players who's getting beat.
All right. Anything else you guys want to say about this format before we move on?
I want to make it really clear that Grixis is good. Just in case
I think we all think Grixis is good. There's just like...
Yeah, just want to make that clear.
If you play bad Grixis, like quote unquote bad Grixis, even if you don't play excellent
bad
Grixis,
stage don't play RC.
Yeah, even if you don't play super groundbreaking Grixis, it's still a really good choice. Even if you're a week behind, or 2 weeks behind, or 3 weeks behind, the floor on your cards being the Grixis cards is just so good, and there's a lot of room to just play good games and have a game against everyone.
Yeah. All right, that is going to do it for our main topic. One of the ways to support the show is to go to patreon.com/CCMG. We mentioned it earlier in the show. One of the benefits you get is you get to ask questions on the show, and it's the only way to get your questions into the bonus episodes. So head on over to patreon.com, and we post a link in the Discord where you can ask questions like Adrian asks, how do I take good notes while I'm playing online? How do I improve my memory of games in person? Woo!
Can I go first on this one? Yeah, so this is something that I actually have gone over in coaching with players before, is taking good notes when you're playing online. I would say that there's a couple ways you can do it. You can either, I guess if you're playing on Arena, I would say if you don't have access to replays, locally record some of your matches when you're playing and then go back and take notes on it if it's too hard for you to do in-game. But making a note of, like, just immediately after the game ends, thinking about, okay, what happened in that game? What were the pivotal turns? What were the decision points? Which can be hard on Arena compared to Magic Online, where you have the replays, but replays are a really valuable tool for that. And as far as taking notes, that really also depends on the questions you're asking yourself during the game. I know that there's like some really strong exercises of just asking yourself, okay, what is it that I know or think is in their hand based on how they played, and then writing that down, and then like doing that every turn or reflecting on that as the game progresses. But really getting in the habit of taking the notes in the game really matters. As for memory of games when you're playing in paper, I would say something I would start doing would be when you're keeping life totals on paper, write down next to your life total whenever it changes what caused the change. You can either shorthand that with the player who I learned this from, they actually did it a lot in Legacy. So it'd be like they're playing Shardless Bugmere, and it'd be like, okay, I went from 20 to 19 from Polluted Delta, and then my opponent took 2 on a Thoughtseize. So they would write those things down. So then when you look back at the game, you see all of the ways that life was lost and how the turns kind of flowed, and you can see them all sequentially in that way. And that can help a lot.
I have a real problem with this in Adrian in my own personal life, because I have really bad short-term memory. And one of the things that I'll find is if I'm playing Arena and I'm sideboarding and I don't remember what I just played against game 1, especially if I won, I'm like, oh, I should not be playing Arena right now. I'm clearly not focused on the right things in playing Magic. I need to take a step back. So that's the first thing, is when are you getting lost? I think is a question that you should be asking yourself. One of the recommendations that I would give, I did a series called Quest for 10, where I try to get 10 wins with every metagame deck in Standard, and take notes on every match through that process until I got to 10 wins. And it actually helped me a lot with this specifically, because it forced me to like look back on the matches and ask myself questions like, how did I win? Why did I win? What happened in the match? And eventually that just becomes muscle memory, because your brain, you're stretching that muscle in your brain. That would be my recommendation, is to try something like that.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, assuming you're running notes to review, like Gabe said, if you don't know this, Magic Online records all your games when you play, and you can click the gear in the top right and go to game history, and it has the last 200 games I think you've played. So if you didn't know that, that's a great way to go look over your games. It's a great way to improve. Assuming that that's what you mean by taking notes, just take a little bit of time and like write stuff down. One thing that I tell people to do who are really bad at they say like, oh, I can never figure out what my opponent has. Oh, I'm really bad at this. Is I tell them just to write down what they think their opponent's hand is, starting like on turn 3, and just update it. And, and it's just like, okay, I think they have these 4 cards, and like they do something and it wasn't one of those 4 cards, and you like take a second to think about it, and you don't worry about winning that match, because that's not your goal when you're playing. Your goal is to work on this and improve it. As for your real life, in person ones, you obviously can't do that. The people I coach that just have a little notebook, and they like write down a quick summation of the matchup as soon as it's over, and they're done saying, oh, good luck, blah, blah. And they write that down. That way they have it for later, and they're able to, ask questions or whatever, because they have just written it down really quickly. That would be the main thing. But I would say, but I'm also a little unsure of what you mean by notes, so I might not be answering the question right. And I'm sorry if that's the case, bud.
Another way you can participate in the show is by leaving a YouTube comment. We got one that says, found you from a tweet regarding hate towards a member of the crew, and I don't see where it comes from at all. Fantastic jobs, great interview. Best of luck with the show moving forward. Didn't know about the Chapin book. Thanks for sharing. Man, this Chapin book is like getting a lot of love on this podcast lately.
I'm a big proponent of Next Level Magic. It's so
no more talking about it until Chapin sponsor us. We're holding the line now. We've shown what we can do, and now we're holding.
The last time.
That's right.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of publicly address this. A few months ago, we got a patron that his entire goal to join our Patreon was to be mean to me. It was pretty obvious. That person was refunded. I didn't want their money, and they were blocked on Patreon. Since then, we've received reviews, or specifically a review that was in the same vein of the rudeness. And honestly, like, I'm a really transparent and like open person. I have been doing this show for longer than every job I've ever had in my life. I have given more hours of this to this show than Mason and Abe combined. Than most people give to anything. And so, like, if you don't like me, that's fine. Like, that's okay. But like, I'm constructive criticism in a lot of ways. I'm not, because the show's bigger than me. It's bigger than Mason. It's bigger than Abe. But like, it's my show. Like, it's my baby. And it's gonna stay that way. Like, I think that, we did something very different on the show this week, and I'm gonna be really curious after the show to talk to Mason and Abe about how they felt the show went. But like, it was me that made that change, and I'm curious how they felt like it went. The other thing is like, when this is just like general advice, you don't know how somebody across the internet is doing. Like, you don't know their mental state. You don't know their life. And one of the things that I have found myself doing sometimes is like being mean to like celebrities, that like, or like sports people that I don't like. And I constantly find myself deleting those tweets or before I hit send, or like, cause like, I'll give an example, of a person that like, I just wish would stop. It's a player for the Memphis Grizzlies, who just like hits people in the junk, and like, I feel some sort of like natural human reaction to want to tell this person to stop it, and that they're being like an idiot, but like, who cares? Like, 1,000 other people are going to do that, and I don't know his mental, like, he could be having a bad day, and like, I could be pushing him to be even worse, and my mental health has not been good right now. So when we got that review, I wasn't in a good space, and I really appreciate Abe and Mason and the listeners for the kind words. But like, I don't know. Mason has been one of my best friends now for years. Like, and what's really funny is one of the pieces of feedback that we got was that I won't say the exact words, but basically that like I'm on Mason's junk. And I'm gonna be honest, I am probably the biggest Mason Clark fan in the world. Like, and why wouldn't I be? He's like one of my best friends. I'm gonna cheer for him. I also trust Mason. I'm gonna ask for his opinions. I think Mason's better at Magic than me. It would be ridiculous for me not to use Mason as a resource. And if you don't like that, like, I don't think you get what this show is about. Like, in all honesty, I just think you don't get it. Like, we had a whole episode of surrounding yourself with greatness. That was the name of the John Finkel episode. Like, why wouldn't I want to know what Mason thinks, ask Mason questions when I have Mason's time, if I trust him? And, like, the same thing goes for Abe. Like, if I have a question about something that I think Abe is good at, I'm gonna ask Abe. And so, like, some of the feedback I think is mean-spirited, but also, I just think that, like, if you're listening to the show and you don't like that from me, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna stop. Like, I'm just not. So, and I just want Abe, you and Mason to know, like, I love you guys. Like, I like doing the show with you is like the highlight of my week. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's dope.
Love you guys. But to listeners, you did get some people like, are you quitting the show for good? I'm not. I'm here. I just, we got a bad review that was really mean, and I just, like, I didn't want to do the show that day. Like, I don't have to. So, anyway, I appreciate you guys' kind words before last week's episode, but I thought that it would be important for me to be clear that, like, I'm a human, and, like, words can hurt. So, yeah. If you want to join the conversation, you can join the Patreon Discord that is for patrons of $5 or more. It's really awesome. We got some awesome people in there. There's also a public Discord for all of Easy Game Media, as well as the YouTube comments. We just, read that one. And then Twitter, at CCMTG on Twitter. We did a poll today, and you guys ruined it for me. You ruined it. It was perfect, and then it was ruined.
Spencer, we gotta get over the fact that you don't like Modern, man.
It's fine.
You hate. It's all good, man. People like Modern, you like Standard. That's fine, baby.
I'm not gonna lie. I have
don't...
no idea what you're talking about right now because I was at work all day. So
it's okay. It's okay to not like Modern, man.
I like Pioneer, man.
Good. Go vote on Pioneer. You can be the third one. Legacy players out here starving. They just got a bunch of new cards today. They're like, did they even test for this format? No, they didn't. We move on.
They hate new cards.
Yeah.
Before we kind of wrap up overall, though, I just want to mention that we do have a new segment at the end of the show that I forgot to mention about what we talk about the things that we learned while recording this week. So stay tuned for that. If you want to check out the rest of the network, head on over to constructivecriticism.com and see. Right now, we got Mythic Cast with Michaela and myself, as well as Drafting Archetypes with Sam Black. You can leave a like, comment, sub, and review for the show. It's really helpful. It's like probably the best way to support the show if you don't have the funds to like go to Patreon or whatever. It really does help. And you can go bury some mean reviews. Just head on over to the Apple Podcasts and get that thing out of the way. Where can people find you, Abe?
They can find me over at twitter.com/morenothings, where my DMs are open for inquiries about coaching, as well as you can email me over at morenothings@gmail.com for any coaching inquiries you have.
Awesome. Mason?
You can find me each and every week over at Card Kingdom. I'm writing an article. This week it is all about Modern and Elesh Norn in it. You can find me over at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. And if you're interested in coaching, I'm really close to booked up. I have about 8 people a day right now, and I just can't fit many more in and live a normal life. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out to me via DM on Twitter. My Twitter is Mason E. Clark. You can also reach out to me via email, masoneclark@gmail.com.
Or on Patreon at
Patreon.com/ I think it's the Mason Clark. If you type Mason Clark MTG, I pop up. I don't remember what my thing is, to be honest. But
you can find me at Spencer13H. I am not accepting new coaching right now. So if you are currently in coaching with me, I'm going to continue it with you. But I got a new job today. Not sure what my future will look like as far as that time. So
they're all coming to me, baby.
Abe's like, let's go.
Mason's booked up. Spencer's booked up. It's all Abe time.
Abe time is the new podcast on the Constructors.
Could be good.
Yeah, I'll go. I just want to talk about what we learned on the show this week before we say goodbye. And I'm not gonna lie, like I had pretty strong feelings about. Well, I'll go this way. I didn't feel like there was that much of a difference between the Reanimator decks until you guys started talking about them. I'm now, because I have not played them a bunch. Like, I think I've played the black-red one when it first came out with like the big sworn stuff, and now I'm kind of tempted to go try them, the differences between them, and kind of see that.
They're much better now. They play like real decks. Like Big Score is like kind of a meme. Like, yeah,
that makes more sense because I actually thought the deck was bad. So I might give these another spin.
Yeah, I like the Jund one a bit when I was playing it, but I think that the rise of Esper makes me like it just a little bit less. Although I'm really high on Glissa, which is why I like that 4-color Legends deck a lot, as it gets to play Glissa in a way that it lives and attacks some amount of the time. But yeah, I think it's pretty solid.
Hey, what about you?
Yeah, actually, one of the decks that I have played 0 of and don't really, I'm not as high on as you guys, has been Mono Blue. But every time that I hear you guys talk about that deck, I like understand what it's doing, but I feel like I really just get a lot more out of like, that understanding and really like seeing that, Spencer, you saying that you felt like it played more like a control deck really aligned with my, theory based on looking at the deck lists about like when it includes Delver and when it doesn't in terms of what its role winds up being. And that was really good to hear solidified of just like, yeah, it does actually just play that way and really try to protect the Haughty Djinn or the Solarian Terror, and it's looking for that window.
Yeah, I mean, there are aggressive games, right? Like, just to be clear, maybe we didn't mention this on the podcast, but there are games where you get like a tear down really fast and you just turn it sideways 4 times and win. But those are kind of rare.
Yeah. Also, there's some games where like I play like 5 control magic post boards in a lot of matchups, and people just like come in with a bunch of kill spells or whatever. I'm just like, yeah, 2 for 1 you, yeah, 2 for 1 you. Stick the Haughty Djinn, eventually you lose. Like, it is an impressive deck. It's also just really hard, which is not a good thing. Playing hard decks doesn't give you bonus points. But what I learned from this week is it really helped me sort of define some like thoughts that I had, whereas like it seems like everything is sort of circulating around like these sort of rules, but I hadn't really thought about it. And when looking over sort of the power rankings and talking with y'all, it's sort of like, yeah, there's Toxic, there's Soldiers, there's Red, and then there's Esper Legends. And those are like the aggro decks, or like the proactive decks. And then those decks are all like, there's one to pick for each weekend to get underneath Grixis. And then Mono White tries to fight on the right axis to beat Grixis and not lose to one of those decks. And that sort of solidifying that and understanding that was really helpful to me with acknowledging the other, parts of the metagame as well.
That is going to do it for this week's episode. Thank you everybody so much for listening. And we'll see you guys all next time with another episode of Constructed Criticism.